Of course, it is not human nature to want to be enslaved. Slavery, as it was practiced in America, had a dehumanizing effect, leaving the slaves with no hope for a better life. Slaves had started to revolt and plan conspiracies even before the beginning of the American Revolution. The slaveholders greatly feared the uprising of their slaves, and their fears were confirmed in 1791 with the Haitian Revolution.
The whites felt at that time that these people who were here, these free black people, remaining here would be threatening to their society and their economy. So it would be good to get rid of them. And those who were still holding slaves felt if those free people remain here, they will still bring up about some disturbance.
White Americans feared a massive slave uprising similar to the Haitian Revolution and were intimidated by free blacks becoming an integral part of the country's economy. The question was, what to do about it? Thomas Jefferson, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence and a slave owner himself, wrote that all men are created equal. But the language was not meant to be inclusive and therefore was never applied to blacks, including free blacks. Full and equal citizenship would never occur under the government of his time. When Thomas Jefferson was a member of the General Assembly, he could not envision an integrated society in which free blacks were American citizens. He made a proposal to Congress for the emancipation and colonization of free blacks from the state of Virginia. The terms of the bill provided for the acquisition of territory elsewhere in the world for the gradual colonization of free blacks in a land of their own.
The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, the most degrading submission on the other. I tremble for my country when I think that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. The blacks may assert their freedom. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest.
Although Jefferson had a strong argument, Congress rejected the idea. Meanwhile, there was a growing movement to abolish slavery.
And simply put, it was a moral force they thought they would bring to bear within the body politics to persuade their fellow Americans that it was immoral, it was ungodly to hold people in slavery. The thing to do was to abolish slavery and grant to these people their full citizenship.
By 1807, Congress had not abolished slavery, but had outlawed the trading of slaves by voting to ban their importation. Instead of the slave trade coming to a close, it flourished as traders continued illegally importing slaves through North Carolina for use in the southern agricultural states. You see, Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin 10 years earlier, which had made the cotton crop very profitable. So the plantation owners needed even more slaves to keep up with the demand. Despite the increase in demand for slaves, the idea of colonization had not died. Jefferson, now president, contacted the British to secure their consent to send free blacks from America to Sierra Leone, the country established by the British for the repatriation of their freed slaves. Again, he was denied. It was a wealthy free black shipping merchant by the name of Paul Cuffey, a strong proponent of colonization, who secured the immigration of free blacks to that West African country. In 1811, he sailed to Sierra Leone and founded the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone for the purpose of sending free blacks to that country. The War of 1812 further deferred the colonization of free blacks, but Paul Cuffey would not let the dream die. In 1815, he transported 38 free blacks from Massachusetts to Sierra Leone at his own expense, a sum of $4,000. To some of us, that's a lot of money even now. So imagine the significance of his investment then. In 1817, Paul Cuffey died before his dream was fully realized. But his success was a turning point in efforts for colonization. Another strong proponent of the cause Reverend Robert Finley saw colonization as an opportunity for charitable work, a chance to bring Christianity to Africa. In time, the former slaves who went to Africa would carry out this mission.
The thinking of that period among Westerners, which they were, clearly was no different from that of other white Americans. So part of their mission for going to Africa was, of course, to Christianize and civilize the savage Africans.
Many free blacks, devout Christians, wanted to return to the homeland of their forefathers, but they were unable to solicit support on their own behalf because they couldn't vote and had little chance for political or educational opportunities. They were less than whites, in a sense non-citizens in this white elitist society, despite the fact that they were theoretically free. So, a growing number wanted to emigrate to Africa, but other free blacks wanted to stay in America and fight for the abolishment of slavery. At that time, the abolishment of slavery seemed unlikely, since there was still a continuous flow of slaves being imported into America illegally. But the population of free blacks was also still growing, and what to do about that remained a topic of great concern. Reverend Finley traveled to Washington, D.C. to win the support of the government. While there, he won the support of his brother-in-law, Elias Caldwell, clerk of the Supreme Court, and his friend, Francis Scott Key. Together, the three canvassed citizens, churches, and other organizations to gain support for their plan. They formed the American Society for the Colonization of Free People of Color, later known as the American Colonization Society. The ACS was one of the most distinguished group of citizens ever assembled in any organization in American history.
When the American Colonization Society was formed in December of 1816, all of its leaders were white, many of them slaveholders who did not want a free black population in the United States. They felt that the free black population belied slavery, that if you had a slave here and you said blacks were only capable of slavery, and then you had a rich seaman, black man like Paul Cuffey, owning ships and traveling up and down the coast, how are you going to continue to claim that blacks are only able to be slaves?
Oh yeah, his whole career, Lincoln. So you really have to understand, you have to read my new book to really fully understand all this stuff, but when it comes out in October. But the North really was, Tocqueville noticed in the 1830s that the irony that even though there was slavery in the North in the 1830s, but there was much more of it in the South. But Tocqueville noticed that racism was actually worse in the North than in the South. And there's a book by Joanne Mellish, who teaches at Brown University. It's called Disowning Slavery, about how the northern states got rid of slavery beginning in 1794 and ending in 1865 in New Jersey. It's a long time. Most of the slaves were not freed, but were sold to southern plantation owners. The relatively few free blacks who remained in the North had no rights to speak of for the most part. In a few places they did, but most places they didn't. And they were literally burned out in many communities in New England. They literally burned down their homes and things like that. And so there's a really ugly history of that. And these were Lincoln's supporters. These were Lincoln's supporters, the North. He didn't get any votes from the South. And so his promise to keep slavery out of the territories was partly a promise to keep black people out of the territories. The way I put it in my forthcoming book is that the Free Soil Party of Lincoln was in line with them. They were the big supporters of Lincoln. They were in favor of land giveaways. That's why it's called free soil. But they were also in favor of soil that was free of black people. You should just read what they said. And so Lincoln favored deporting the blacks to Liberia or Panama, Haiti, anywhere but here. And even when he did mention during his presidency of the possibility of buying the freedom of some of the slaves in the border states, he coupled as a way of ending slavery there he coupled that with a requirement that any slaves that were freed in that way, which is, by the way, how all slaves were freed. The other 94% of all the slaves in the Western Hemisphere were freed voluntarily in that way. Lincoln wanted to couple that with deportation. If there were any slaves in Maryland or Missouri that were to be freed, they were to be immediately deported to Haiti or someplace like that. And so you have to understand that he was a master politician, and that was his constituency. They wanted a white continent north of the Mason-Dixon line. There's another new book out by Michael Lind called, What Lincoln Believed. And Lind takes on the Lincoln historians for ignoring this, ignoring Lincoln's white supremacist views and the views of all his supporters in the North. And it's kind of refreshing for me to read an honest writer for a change on this whole argument. And Lind he goes so far as to, he almost praises him for making these statements. And it's kind of hard to figure out why he's so praiseworthy of this, but he does. So this is no secret, no big secret. It's just been swept under the rug. So there were, there are all kinds of opinions, but Van Auken makes the case that the big majority of British opinion makers thought that the South had a right to secede and that the war was not to free the slaves. They didn't think it was any more sincere. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it only applied to rebel territory. That meant it only applied to areas where no slave could be freed. And so European opinion makers looked at this and thought it was rank hypocrisy, because at the time it specifically exempted, in words, all the parishes in Louisiana that were under control of the Union Army at the time. It specifically exempted West Virginia, which where there were slaves, but it was part of the Union. And it exempted New Jersey, where there were slaves, still slaves in New Jersey. And so the Emancipation Proclamation said, we're going to free the slaves where they cannot be freed, but where they are freed, it doesn't apply. Or where they are able to be freed, it doesn't apply. And so in my book, I quote various European opinion makers as saying this is a fraud. This didn't free anybody. And a lot of them thought it was essentially an attempt to incite slave insurrections in the South, not a real emancipation proclamation in a genuine sense. A lot of them voiced that kind of opinion. In every major battle of the war, there were northern slave owners who fought against southern yeoman farmers who never owned slaves, because there were slaves in the border states and in some of the northern states like New Jersey, and their owners who were in the war were allowed to keep their slaves if their state was in the Union. And so, and then of course the big majority of southern soldiers were yeoman farmers and small merchants who were actually harmed by slavery because they had to compete for jobs with slave labor, or if they were small farmers, they didn't have slaves on their small farms. They had to compete with the big plantations. And so they wasn't in their benefit either. And they would have formed a natural political constituency, I think, for the peaceful emancipation, which is what occurred everywhere else on the planet in the 19th century. Now, I guess one more. He had his hand up first. Then Mark Thornton is standing by, I see. Yes, sir.
Did the Southerners want to completely abolish the tariffs and fund?
Okay, so what I want to discuss is the moral issue of I want to look at the secession from the moral point of view of what is the relationship between slavery and secession. There was almost universal agreement among antebellum Americans, North and South, on the moral status of slavery. This usually isn't brought out, but most everybody agreed about it, North and South. Most agreed that abstractly considered, you just think about it as abstract proposition, slavery is immoral, but they also thought that it must be acquiesced in out of practical necessity. Larry Ties, who's written a wonderful book on the pro-slavery arguments, has called this the negative pro-slavery argument, and has shown that it was first deployed not by Southerners but by late 18th century Northerners responding to Samuel Johnson-type criticisms from Europeans after Americans had gained their independence. It was a stock part of what he calls the counter-revolution that swept the North at the turn of the century and eventually the South, as Americans recoiled from the more radical implications of the democratic ideals of the Revolution. Now, even Calhoun's teaching that slavery is a positive good was not the radical doctrine hitherto unknown in America that historians have tirelessly said it was. Calhoun carefully separated the question of, quote, slavery in the abstract, as Southerners called it, from slavery as a practical moral question. He tried to make clear that his point was only about the latter, and that under the institution, the African population had in fact made remarkable progress and was capable of further improvements. He called the institution, quote, an experiment, which should be given a period of time, and he put no limit on the improvements Africans were capable of. But what was this universal practical necessity that forced acceptance of slavery? It was, in a word, white European supremacy. Most Americans, North and South, vast majority, believed that America was a white European polity and that neither the Indian nor the African population would ever participate as social and political equals. This was the common assumption. Now let's see how this assumption works in Northern policy in regard to Africans. Northern manumission laws were designed to rid the North of its African population. It was not actual slaves that were freed, but those born after a certain date and upon achieving a certain age. By 1860, the formerly slave-trading state of Massachusetts had reduced its African population to around 1%. In many states, emancipation was accompanied with a period of apprenticeship. New Jersey, for example, abolished slavery, but only after defining those freed as apprentices for life. Most northern states passed laws prohibiting the entrance of free blacks or severely restricting their entrance. Free blacks were shut out of New Jersey. Massachusetts at one time prescribed flogging for non-residents who stayed longer than 2 months. Ohio at one time passed a law expelling the entire black population. A number of states erected constitutional barriers to the entrance of free blacks. The language of Oregon's constitution was typical. Quote, no free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall ever come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contract, or maintain any suit therein, and the Legislative Assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such free Negroes who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them therein, end quote. The state of Indiana's constitution read almost the same way. Now, Illinois once allowed free blacks to enter, but only if they posted a bond of $1,000 each. A lot of money back then. But after 1848, white supremacy became even more insistent in some northern and western states. Illinois, for example, changed its constitution in 1848 to absolutely exclude the further entrance of free blacks or mulattoes. In 1853, the legislature of Illinois enacted statutes to enforce the ban. Oregon's constitution banning the entrance of free blacks passed by a vote of 8-1 in 1857. Now, once in a northern state, blacks were tightly managed. Just to give you one example from Illinois, which was admittedly a pretty rough state for this sort of thing. Its revised statutes after 1833 say, if any person or persons shall permit or suffer any servant or servants of color to the number of 3 or more to assemble in his, her, or their outhouse, yard, or shed for the purpose of dancing or reveling, either by night or day, the persons or persons so offending shall forfeit and pay a fine of $20. And it's the duty of all coroners, sheriffs, justices, judges of the peace, judges who learn of such assemblages to commit the servants to the jail of the county, and on view of proof thereof, order each and every such servant to be whipped, not exceeding 39 stripes on his or her back, end quote. So you can get the point, you know. Now, Illinois is worth pondering because it was Lincoln's state and because he supported its oppressive black codes and never objected to them throughout his career. All right, let's look at Illinois. Once in Illinois, blacks were not citizens. Remember, back then, only a state could make you a citizen. Once you became one, then you had the privileges and immunities of citizens everywhere. You're not a citizen if you're in Illinois, and black. You could not vote. You could not even serve on a jury, and you could not even testify against whites in court. So if somebody started messing with your property, you had to get somebody to help you go to court, somebody testify on your behalf. You could not intermarry with whites, and you were forced to pay taxes for a public school system that excluded black children. No segregated school system. Just none. Lincoln voted for and supported these laws because he did not believe that free blacks would ever have social and political equality with whites. He held to this position throughout his career and repeated it publicly everywhere in language that cannot be disguised. In one of the debates with Stephen Douglas, September 18, 1858, he declared, quote, "I will say then that I am not, nor have ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have ever been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race," end quote.